So I'm not going to take up much of your time with my rambling, and let's immediately dive into the questions. Oh, sorry. Before that, let me look at the polls and see what our topic will be for next month. I'm going to end polling now. So the topic that won narrowly is emotional avoidance and hair pulling. The runner-up is anxiety and relaxation techniques. So next month, we'll talk about emotional avoidance, and then I will put this list up next month, as well as with anything you suggest today. And then you can maybe vote for anxiety next time. So let's get on with the show. Question 1. Is hair pulling related to genetics? So I think the safest answer to give at this time with the knowledge that we have is no. I have seen a few studies, and in one of the older webinars where we talked about research and science, I even mentioned some of them. These studies tried to see if there are any connections between genes that regulate grooming and hair pulling. And there are some results, but they are really not very conclusive. So the answer that we have now is likely no. What I've noticed, though, is that often there are connections with family dynamics and the behaviors that we learn as we grow up. So that's something that is, I think, much more likely at this time. You know, in a decade or two, science might change its mind, but this is not something that that we have evidence for. Also, to be perfectly honest, let me just go on a short rant about this. Sometimes as a therapist, I wouldn't say get upset, but I get slightly annoyed when people explain away their behavior with their genes. Because what you're basically saying is this is how I'm hardwired and I'm stuck with it. That's simply not a very productive attitude to adopt in therapy. So for purposes of therapy, sorry, the squeaking sound is me pouring some water. So if the purpose of therapy is to change you by psychological means, then the best way to conceptualize your problem is in psychological terms. So that it's just a very pragmatic issue for me. Of course, obviously, I do think the biology and genes have an influence on something, but for hair pulling, there's really very little evidence, and it's also not very change-friendly to conceptualize the problem that way. Are the previous webinars available if we're not paying for the Trickstop? Yes. You can simply, in a couple of days, sometimes in the beginning of next week, you should receive an email with a link to the recording of this webinar, and then just look at the whole channel and you'll see that all the webinars are there. How can I check the other webinar from the past months? So our YouTube channel has all of them. So yeah, just wait for the link and then, or just find the channel. I think there are 2 Trickstop channels. I'm not sure really why, but I think there are. One contains only one webinar or so, and then the second channel contains all of them. Last month's webinar was on pulling trances. The one before that was about habit formation. Sorry. Okay. So what you're saying is the competing response must be as fulfilling as hair pulling. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that a competing response must work. And when I say it must work, meaning that when you apply the competing response, you don't pull. It's very hard to find a competing response that is equally satisfying as the act of pulling itself. And trying to do that is, if you can find it, perfect. Share it with me here, and I will be happy to share it with everyone else and read it out loud. But most of the time, there will be a kind of residual tension remaining. And if you remember, there's one part of habit reversal training that's called relaxation training, and this is why we have it. So that you can make sure to reduce your anxiety to the extent that this kind of differential tension that remains after a competing response isn't overwhelming. If you can find it, again, great, but mostly I wouldn't focus on the sensation. I would focus on the efficiency, whether or not you can replace pulling with it, and that's it. I'm really quite embarrassed about my hair pulling, and I haven't told anyone about it. I don't think I have the courage to tell my roommate or best friend about my problem. That's perfectly understandable, and I don't think that you have to tell people about your problem. I think it can be freeing. It can kind of connect you to other people. It can make you feel more accepted and appreciated. once they understand and accept you with the problem. But I don't think that's mandatory, and I don't think necessarily everyone wants to do that, right? So it depends on whether or not you actually feel the need to do that. I'm a big believer in privacy, so I think that whatever we want to keep private is really up to us. So you absolutely don't have to. However, I would kind of ask you to think how much this shame that you're talking about is preventing you from changing. Because very often when we stigmatize our behavior, it's not just that we hide it from the outside world, it's also that we don't accept it entirely. So if you don't accept the problem entirely, you can't really quite see it clearly. And if you can't see it clearly, then you can't come up with good strategies to deal with it. So regardless of whether or not you choose to share the fact that you pull with other people, think about this and how much of it you still have to accept. Regarding identifying context and stimuli, just one second. What if I pull in every context and most of the time? I do it while I watch TV, driving, talking to others, when laying in bed, etc. This means that you might struggle with finding proper competing responses, but I wouldn't. So, okay, it's hard to say I pull in this specific context, but that doesn't mean that your pulling is exactly the same in every context. What you can do is start by splitting it up into two parts. Where is my pulling focused, and then where is my pulling mindless or automatic? So that can be a major distinction for you. And then based on the data that you collect while you do awareness training, you can try and delimit two contexts starting from this. You can also see all these contexts that you mentioned, what is it that they share in common, and then group them into, let's say, two super contexts, or however you want to call it. And then select a group of competing responses for this. The strategy that I suggested now and the previous one when I was explaining response training is not like the end all and be all. If you find another way to introduce competing responses and select the right ones, good for you. This is not something that you have to rigidly adhere to. It's just something that I've noticed that works for most people. So I'm suggesting it as, it's a proposal, it's not a command. Awareness training is a must, and compliance is a must. But how you select techniques, I just told you about what's sufficient for most people. Compliance training seems like it is about nurturing the inner child. Well, habit reversal training, being highly reductionist, sort of very behaviorist as an intervention, doesn't really know terms like inner child and things like this. I understand exactly why you said what you said, and I think it's a nice way to conceptualize it and go ahead and do it, but you don't need to have a concept like that to do compliance training. But definitely it is about getting to know that rebellious, disobedient, nonverbal, screaming, dissatisfied part of yourself that doesn't like the way things are, but also doesn't want to change, for example. That's how I like to imagine it for myself. What do you think about the effectiveness of using hypnotherapy with HRT? So to my knowledge, there is absolutely no evidence that hypnotherapy works. When I say no evidence, meaning that I've never seen a study that analyzes hypnotherapy for hair pulling, or most other things, to be perfectly honest. This, however, doesn't mean that you will not benefit from it. I've had, over the years at Trickstop, I've had numerous clients that have used hypnotherapy. Some have said that it has worked for them for a while, but not forever. And about a half of them, or more or less, didn't really have any benefits from it. So the results are, give or take. If you have a chance to try it and you can afford trying it, I don't see how it can harm you. I pull out the hair from my scalp and pubic area. I often find myself being more okay with pulling from my pubic area because no one will ever see it. Would it be recommended that I work towards stopping all pulling? Well, this really depends on you. The way I approach these things and change in general as a therapist is that I don't think it's my business to tell people what to change and how to change. I can propose something that works, or I can ask questions so that we can flesh out what works for you and to understand specifically the problem that you deal with. But whether or not you will try to change it, that's really up to you. For example, there's one thing in your text here that stood out to me, which is that it seems like your motivation to change is what is for other people, because pulling what people don't see seems to be okay with you, whereas what people see is not okay with you. To me, that sounds like something to explore a little more. Whether or not you want to change it, it's up to you, but I think it's really interesting that hurting yourself is okay as long as no one sees it, to put it in slightly blunt and perhaps too broad a way. What are grounding exercises? So grounding exercises there's dozens of them. What they all do together is that they kind of pull you away from your internal experiences and ground you in your senses. Grounding in this context means that you shift your focus onto these very basic sensory experiences. So one grounding technique is called 5-4-3-2-1. You can Google it. It's explained on numerous websites. Basically, what you do is you shift your focus to different sensory modalities, and then you count a certain number of objects. So, for example, you can take a deep breath, name 5 things that you see. This means that you have to shift your focus from, let's say, the urge to pull or your racing thoughts or anything else onto what you see, then onto what you hear, then onto what you feel, and so on and so on. So that way you shift your focus. But what I was trying to say is at the same time, when we pay attention to our senses, that tends to make us feel very safe. One of the mindfulness exercises that I recommend to people is body scanning. Body scanning is a great way to supplement your awareness training. But at the same time, when you spend some time focusing on how your body feels, like the way it touches the surface you're sitting on, the way your clothes feel, just anchoring yourself in this basic function of your mind and your body in perception really helps to make you feel safe. So that would be grounding. 5-4-3-2-1 is just one example. Meditation can be seen as a form of grounding. There are other exercises like sort of pressing your feet onto the ground and literally dozens of others. What is it about you that allows you to form habits easily? I don't believe it's just luck. Well, it's not something I ever worked on, to be perfectly honest. I didn't even know that it was a thing. It's only when I started working as a therapist that I noticed that maybe even not as a therapist, when I started teaching mindfulness, I realized that a lot of people struggle to do it regularly. When I started meditating, my idea was, okay, I like this. I'm just going to wake up every morning half an hour earlier and just sit and do it. And then I did. I don't know how to explain that really. Willingness, I guess. I honestly really never did anything. And there are also, I'm sure there are areas of everyone's life where people can do that. Can this method be also associated to an 11-year-old, or is it mostly for adults? You can use it for children as well. I don't think that the Trickstop as a program would necessarily be appropriate for an 11-year-old child, because the program is designed for adolescents and adults. But habit reversal training as such has been used on children very successfully for tics, for stuttering, for hair pulling, for just really any type of repetitive behavior. I had somewhere on my computer, I don't work with children, but by preparing for this, I downloaded a flyer on how to use habit reversal training for children. So you can try Googling it, and if you don't find it, you can email me. There's my email down here, and I'll send it to you. It's not very comprehensive, but it will give you some tips, and the procedure is exactly the same, but it will give you some tips specifically for children, and hopefully it's useful. What if I'm completely aware of when my pulling happens, my triggers, and I'm absolutely conscious of when, why, and how, but no matter how many times I tell myself during a session to stop, I can't. I have developed new healthy habits that have decreased my pulling, but I cannot seem to stop. I can easily go a week without pulling, but I relapse way harder, and it's always in private, never in public or in front of anyone. What steps should I take from here? Okay, so obviously in this situation, stimulus control is something to explore further, and then really try to develop these habits, because they will reduce triggers. there's something that is very interesting to me. You said that you know exactly what your triggers are and so on and so on. In that case, maybe you can think about relapse control. If you know exactly what your triggers are, that means that you should have no problems predicting when you will pull. If you can predict, then you can also make sure to avoid or do something to make it easier for yourself if you cannot avoid triggering situations. So you seem to have all the right tools. In terms of habit reversal, focus on stimulus control and make sure to think about different ways to do relapse prevention. That's also something that we can maybe do one of the webinars because it seems like an important topic. So yeah, maybe we can do a webinar on that as well. For now, I suppose you can Google relapse control and see some of the approaches and techniques that are up there. Do you have any suggestions on how to get around the perfectionism of wanting to log every time you pick your skin or pull your hair and apply HRT to skin picking? Should I also record scanning my skin for scabs to pick? So the approach to HRT, regardless, it doesn't matter if it's hair pulling or skin picking, it's exactly the same thing. I mean, they're not exactly the same thing, but in terms of habit reversal training, the approach is identical. So use the self-monitoring app and then see what your triggers are and where you pick or pull, select techniques, and then do everything as I sort of indicated here. I think when it comes to logging, if you pick or pull quite a lot, then I don't think it's very useful to also log just scanning your skin, because it would just take too much time. Again, if perfectionism is what's making you log every instance, then perfectionism is really what you should be working on, not just necessarily logging. But if you're a perfectionist, try to give yourself very specific logging tasks. So say Monday through Wednesday, I will log pulling only, or picking only, or focus picking only. So that way you will narrow the scope of what you need to monitor, so you're less likely to fail. Hence, perfectionism will be less of an obstacle. It might take you longer to do the whole awareness training thing, but this is a way to go about it without much frustration. How do you find there are Zoom calls or groups for people to talk about pulling with others that have the same issue? So there are TLC support groups that I know of, and we have a forum on Trickstop, so you can see what people are writing there and exchange experiences there. I've had clients who told me about Reddits where they would talk to people, and even Facebook groups, although I'm not on Facebook, so I really wouldn't know much about that. But check out the TLC website for sure. They have, I mean, aside from this, they have a ton of really useful resources. This is a recurring question, so I'll see if I can do something specific about that for you in the future. Does trick ever go away, or you just have to live repeating techniques and reminding yourself not to pull? That's really difficult to say. There's really no reason why you wouldn't get rid of trick altogether through therapy. But so in terms of Trickstop and the therapy that I practice, I find that almost everyone who goes through therapy with someone who knows what they're doing will reduce their symptoms. That's almost a given. Whether or not they will go away entirely depends on obviously how long you stay in therapy, how compliant you are, also what are some of the underlying causes of pulling. With hair pulling specifically, I noticed that there are often connections to trauma or in certain, but not a very high number of cases, but in a certain number of cases, there's overlap and comorbidities with other mental health conditions that also need to be treated so that you can fully get rid of pulling. So it's possible, but not as easy. And there's another thing that often happens, which I don't think of as a problem, but I've seen people comment on it, so it's important to address, which is that there might be times in your life, even if you never pull again, there might be times in your life when you will feel the urge to pull. This in itself should not be considered a relapse. The same way that you go on a diet and then go off of a diet and you don't think of having appetite as being pathological. the way I like to think about urges to pull as just information that something is happening. So the fact that we connected a specific complex of body sensations with pulling is why we call something an urge to pull. Right. So in that sense, it's also useful to think about, why is it that I'm having this sensation now? So what is my body telling me? What is it that I need to attend to? If you remember, one of the things that I said is that pulling is sometimes a way to self-soothe. So if an urge to pull arises at any time in the future, it just might mean that you need calming, soothing, or you need to attend to one of your other needs. So you can see it as information. And then through the acceptance and commitment part of Trickstop, you learn how to relate to the urge itself slightly differently. So it's no longer your enemy. Is Trickstop covered by insurance? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. The best way to know is to contact your insurance company. I know that our customer support will issue an invoice if you need it monthly, so that you can get reimbursement from your insurance company, but they don't always cover it. We've had clients from Europe, and their insurance would cover it for much longer than 2 months. And from the US, sometimes yes, sometimes no. So my job is to be a therapist and to do the webinars, so I don't know much about billing. You can also email our support and see if maybe they know specific insurance companies, but it's much faster to just check with your insurance company. So I suppose my question is, how do I approach the subject with my roommate? Well, I guess that depends on what kind of a relationship you have with your roommate. If you're close, what I would do is just give a very short introductory speech about vulnerability and compassion and acceptance and sort of what is it that you need, and then I would proceed telling them. That's a way to give them the necessary information that they have, but it's also a way to kind of scout the attitude that they have towards you. So if they're not willing to be accepting or compassionate or kind or just shut up and listen to you, then maybe it's not the time to tell them. So first approach it from this perspective in terms of talking about, that you have something to share, and then sort of say what is it that you need from them, and then see if they can provide it for you. I've heard about 2 medications called NAC and taurine. What do you think of these? You know about them. So the first one sometimes works, sometimes doesn't work. And there are studies that show that after 12 weeks of NAC, you reduce your pulling even by 50%, although I don't remember how many patients in the study benefited from it, but you can theoretically reduce your pulling by even 50%, but you need very high dosages of NAC, and you need to use it for at least 12 weeks. In terms of what my clients have been saying about it, the results are kind of all over the place. There are some people who benefit from it, some who don't, but I've yet to see anyone who stopped pulling altogether from using it. The later one you mentioned, there are no studies to my knowledge. Great webinar, thank you. Is this presentation available somewhere in the website? Yeah, like I said, on the YouTube channel. All of the ones that I've mentioned are available on our YouTube channel. Is there a link between hair pulling and ADD, ADHD? I don't think there's necessarily a causal link. I've seen that there's a correlation and that there's an overlap. So often our clients who struggle with trick will struggle with ADHD as well. And sometimes ADHD will make it more difficult to deal with trick, and it will be triggering as well. Reason being, if you struggle to focus on anything, that will add to anxiety and frustration and negative self-image. And I guess you can see how that can easily be just another trigger for pulling. So it happens together in a certain number of cases. The most common co-occurring condition with hair pulling is skin picking, and then OCD in the second place, and I believe borderline personality disorder and some other anxiety disorders are the most common ones that co-occur together. I feel like I avoid starting a love relationship because deep down I'm scared of trichotillomania, and I feel ashamed to share this with other people. How can I deal with this fear of relationships? Well, on a very basic level, relationships are about acceptance. This is a problem that you struggle with. It's currently a part of you, but hopefully it won't be forever. But it is something that people have to accept. For me, acceptance in relationships is a given. I feel like people, because they lack self-esteem or self-confidence, or even more generally, call me Oprah, but self-love, I feel like in lack of all these, people don't really expect to be accepted in relationships. Even if you're the most difficult person in the world, if someone wants to be in a relationship with you, then they're in a relationship with the most difficult person in the world, period. When you love someone, you don't love their good sides only and hate their bad sides. You have to kind of accept the whole package. So not to say that you should start every date with, hello, I struggle with trichotillomania, uh, especially because the word is just so grotesque sounding that kind of makes it sound worse than it really is. But it is something that people should be able to accept about you. Like, it should be a condition of, it should be on your part a condition for someone to be in a relationship with you. I guess that's what I'm saying. Because there will always be something on the other side to accept as well. So people should be able to give and take. How effectively can HRT be used to help with tics and OCD? It helps with tics, and it's quite an effective technique. With OCD, I know that it is used with OCD. However, when I work with clients that have OCD, I almost never use it, to be perfectly honest with you, because I feel like there are other more effective ways to deal with OCD. And also, I think it's much harder to treat OCD as just a habit, because it's much more intense, and it's also more, I don't know how to explain that, but there's always this, it's just a more severe condition, let me put it this way. And then because it is more severe, it requires a more comprehensive solution. So CBT is very effective for, I mean, more modern and complex versions of CBT are more effective for obsessive compulsive disorder than just habit reversal training. There is evidence that it can work, but like I said, you can find much more efficient treatments. Everything in life is stressing, agreed. The least inconvenience stresses me and provokes the urge. I'm a perfectionist. I find it very difficult to relax. So I'm not going to read your name. Hi to everyone. I'm happy to have attended this webinar. Thank you. Well, you're welcome. Sending you my love. Oh, thank you. And to me and to everyone else who struggles with trick out there. What you're basically describing here is that you have a hard time tolerating your emotional responses. So maybe what you can look into is ways of working with intense emotions. We had one webinar, but I don't know exactly what month that was, forgive me, but it was something over the summer where we talked about emotional regulation. So that's one thing that you can deal with. And also maybe look into different ways to deal with experiential avoidance. You can work, mindfulness is also quite good for this because it teaches you to accept your experiences as they come along. CBT can also be very helpful for you because it will help you, acceptance and commitment therapy specifically, because it redefines your relationship to your experience. So you'll learn how to accept and be with these inconveniences. So yeah, emotional regulation, the short answer. Thank you for this session, you're welcome. Totally aware of passing through stressful situations nowadays, cannot stop it, as if something is forcing me to do so. How to handle this? I would need a little more information to be able to give you a specific answer, but just based on what I have, the way to go about this is to focus on stimulus control. So if you're unable to apply a competing response, then the next logical step is to eliminate triggers. And if you know what are the contributing causes, like whether it's anxiety or tension or guilt or anything else, trauma, whatever it is, then focus on treating that. If you can, it's similar to if any one of you attended the trances webinar. One thing that I said is that the best way to deal with a pulling trance is before it actually occurs. And when it occurs, basically the only thing you can do is to have someone snap you out of it. So you need to focus on prevention rather than coping strategies. Does the Trickstop app work for other repetitive disorders like nail biting? Yeah, you can use it for them as well. Maybe not all fields would. Yeah, come to think of it, I'm just going through the app in my mind. Yeah, you can absolutely use it for nail biting as well. Why does hair pulling start at a young age, like 7 or 8? It doesn't always start at a young age. There are roughly two groups. I found this study that basically did a cluster analysis of people who struggle with hair pulling, and they found that there are two groups: people who start at a very young age, and then people who start in adolescence. The older you are, the smaller the chance that you will start. So you would be in the younger group. For me, it's very difficult to give a generalized answer as to why hair pulling starts at all. If you think about it, even if it's self-soothing, if it's what hair pulling does, there's so many ways that people self-soothe, right? So any BFRB is self-soothing, for example. People will sleep a lot to kind of escape the world and relax that way. So there's so many ways that, there's so many ways to self-soothe and so many symptoms out there, and yet some people will specifically connect self-soothing to hair pulling. And usually the way that takes place is a very individual story. So it's something that you can answer, but the answer is in your past. It's not in any study that I can offer. For me, that's one of the beauties of psychotherapy, is that you get to explore these things quite a lot. So we therapists have the method, so how to go about exploring your past and figuring it out, but we don't really have a universal recipe to answer the question. My skin and hair follicles are very sensitive and irritable. This sometimes happens when you pull a lot, that your hair follicles become sensitive, and it also can happen when you have an actual skin condition. So before using habit reversal training, maybe you can consult someone like a pharmacist or a dermatologist, even better, and see if they can work on the physical irritation. At the same time, working on the physical causes is also a form of stimulus control, because you're removing a layer of triggers for yourself. So that's incredibly important to address, and then do that before you start with habit reversal. Is it normal for a person to be pulling their hair from a very young age? Well, I don't know, I don't like to talk about normal behavior because I really don't know what that means. But like I said a few minutes ago, there is a group of people that start pulling at a younger age. So that's just a fact for some people. I don't know whether it's normal or not will in any way help you in life, other than to feel bad. The question is whether or not you're bothered by the behavior and whether or not you want to change it, and that's all. Babies show signs of trick, or is it something that develops later? That depends on what age you mean. There is a developmental age for babies when they will just eat anything, hair included. So I wouldn't necessarily consider that, a sign of trichotillomania. I would more probably see that as a developmental period. So it's very important when that happens. It's difficult to answer your question, but I've seen cases where obviously no one remembers being a baby, but I've seen a few cases where clients would tell me that ever since they were very little, like a few years old, they would pull their hair or kind of play with their hair. But this is the information that they get from their parents. Whether or not that was a symptom of trick or just something that children do, that's not something that we can actually reconstruct anyway. What would be the best way to find the most effective competing response for me? So as a general rule, like I said, try to isolate specific contexts where you pull, or simply make a long list of all the situations where you typically pull, and then try to group them by similarity, and then pick 1 or 2 competing responses for each. That's a good place to start. Then make sure to follow up how effective they are, and then replace them as needed. I grew up being told that people that are hair pullers do so because of childhood sexual abuse. Is there a proof of that? There's no specifically, to my knowledge, there are no studies that will say that this is the cause of hair pulling, even for some people. However, I mentioned a few times that trauma is something that I encounter very often when I work with people who pull their hair, and this trauma will include sexual abuse. So for some people, this can have connections, but by no means is it for everyone. And it is also possible that you have had this trauma, but that you pulled for other reasons as well. Oops, 1 second. Accidentally, I closed the questions. I find that if I'm not pulling my hair, I'm usually picking my cuticles. Should I focus just on one BFRB at one time when doing reversal training? If you can find a competing response that works for both picking and pulling, go with both. The goal is not to introduce too many new habits, but it doesn't matter how many symptoms you will cover. The more, the merrier, really. There's one thing that I would like to mention here is that it happens sometimes that when you, because habit reversal training is only concerned with the behavior. Sometimes it happens that when you eliminate one set of symptoms, something else appears, kind of like what you described here. If I don't pull my hair, then I will pick my cuticles. So it's like one symptom goes away, another one shows up. I had a client who struggled with skin picking. I believe it was skin picking, it was a few years ago. And then as she was dealing, because she came and she was very adamant that she doesn't care about introspection or any of that fluffy stuff, she just wanted to get rid of the symptoms. So I thought, okay, we'll just do habit reversal training. And as she was dealing with the primary symptom, she started slowly and occasionally, fortunately, getting panic attacks. So it was almost like you closed one outlet for anxiety and then it exploded in another way. So this is what I mean when I say about treating the underlying causes. So this way you can like spend your lifetime just kind of dealing with individual symptoms, whereas the real issue that's underneath all of them stays undiscovered and untreated. So this is not something habit reversal can help with, because it's just a very technical, practical approach. But other forms of therapy, of course they can. So that's something that you should consider also, like what's underneath this shift of symptoms. Okay, 1 second. Let's go to the next question. Hair pulling for others doesn't make sense. They see my bald patch and they get weirded out. What is the best way to sensibly explain to people who noticed what trichotillomania is? I mentioned the TLC website. They have quite a useful text, actually several of them, that will explain essentially every important facet of trichotillomania. One thing that you can do is, I mentioned self-soothing several times now, and I find that this is a good approach to explain it to people when you say that this is just a mechanism of self-soothing and coping that you've developed, and that it's something that you're working, on sort of treating. But before I even explain this, I would address the being weirded out thing. People will react this way, and they really don't think how that affects others. And because other people are usually ashamed, they never really say anything. And then the people who get visibly weirded out by something, then they don't even know how inappropriate and insulting that is. So the first thing that I would do with these people is to tell them that I understand that it might be strange for them, but it is really hurtful when they react in the way in which they react. And that's also a litmus test for me. If someone is going to make fun of something that hurts me, I really, not only do I not want to share anything with that person, I really don't want them around me to begin with. So this is where I would start. But sort of just kindly telling them that I really don't feel comfortable with someone just staring at me because of a problem that I have, and then I would explain that it's a coping mechanism and then start from there. The reason why I think that's a good entry is because we all use coping mechanisms for something, like more or less functional or dysfunctional, but we all have them. So it's something that everyone will understand. You can also compare it to similar behaviors, like nail biting, that's also quite common, and then say that this is similar to that. Because nail biting is something that a lot of people struggle with at certain points in their life, so it's something that they can also understand more easily. And never allow people to, to treat you badly because of it. Is there a connection between trich and dermatillomania? I think I mentioned this briefly, but yes, so they often occur together and they fall in the same kind of umbrella category of body-focused repetitive behaviors. There's some similarities in neuroscience findings behind each of them. So yes, they're connected, but they are separate entities. What are some of the popular repeating responses for a large population? I suppose you're asking me what works for most people, correct? If that's so, what works for most people is to use stress balls. Worry stones are quite popular because they're very small and practical, so people don't really notice that you're using them. Infinity Cube is something that works for a lot of my clients, and it's something that I discovered just looking for competing responses to suggest to clients. Let me see, I have this is an infinity cube. It's basically a cube that you can kind of bend, assemble, and disassemble in many different ways. I find it just so entertaining. So that's also a competing response that works well. Some of the stimulus control techniques that work for most people are gloves, for example, or wearing hats, or finger covers, or band-aids, or using timers in the bathroom if that's where you pull. That's quite effective as well. My 14-year-old son has been pulling for 7 years. Is it possible that he will grow out of it as he will become more mature? It is possible, but if he has been pulling for 7 years, then there is a chance that it is a solidified habit. It of course doesn't mean that your son will forever pull his hair. It just means that maybe it will be useful to seek some form of help for him as well. If nothing else, to help him change it faster. But if it's been going on for 7 years, it's not that it's in some way different, as a problem. It's just that when a habit is present for a long time, it's much more difficult to get rid of. So it takes more time. So yeah, if you can look for help for him, now would be a great time. When people are young, they tend to change faster and more easily. So this is a much better time to deal with it than when he's older. Can you have trick induced by medication? I was given a neurotoxic antibiotic that down-regulates GABA and was given benzos. I was a mess, and I even discontinued them, but I keep pulling. So benzos are not likely to cause pulling, and I'm not sure about the antibiotic that you mentioned because I'm not sure which one you're talking about specifically. But there are medications that will exacerbate pulling. If you look for the webinar on scientific research and hair pulling, I think I talked about this, and there's a list of medication there as well. But usually, if you discontinue the medication, in that case, pulling will subside as well if it was caused by medication. If medication just sort of augmented an already existing problem, then even when you discontinue the medication, therapy would be the way to resolve the issue. 1 second. Apologies if I missed this explanation at the start, but will this program work for skin picking or only hair pulling? My BFRB is scratching, picking my scalp, which led to significant hair loss rather than hair pulling or hairs directly. So yes, it should be helpful for that as well, because like I said, the principle is the same. It's just that the details are different. But if a therapist knows how to work with hair pulling, they should really know how to work with skin picking as well. Yeah. There's also a specialized program for skin picking that you can find and take that. It's called Skin Pick. So you can find that as well. But this should really work well enough for you. Do you think you can shift your focus from one area to another less visible area and then do the HRT so it doesn't become too much at the same time? I'm not sure. Oh, you mean sort of to just target specifically one area, then deal with that one, then switch to another area? Sure, you can do that as well, yeah. Hello, about the identifying context and stimuli. How can I identify how I feel if I don't exactly know or have a hard time identifying my emotions? This is quite common, and it's a question that I get very frequently. It's okay if you cannot put, let's say, an official label on what you feel. This is, at the end of the day, really not the goal. The idea is that you connect and understand how the process works. So thoughts can cause you to feel a certain way, certain feelings can cause you to think certain thoughts. All these can lead to pulling, and this cycle is important to reconstruct. If you cannot put a verbal label, you can maybe try and connect whatever it is that you feel with something that you use to symbolize emotion. So for me, for example, personally, it's music. So for me, even if I say sadness, to me that's an umbrella term, but in my personal experience, there are at least two types of sadness. Like there's the Chopin mazurka kind of sadness, which is very sentimental and even pleasure, is enjoyable in some way. And then there's the more pathetic Rachmaninoff kind of sadness. This is not any official classification, but as I'm kind of observing my emotions as a therapist and a human being, I kind of realized from my experience that it's important to separate this. And because I like music and art a lot, then for me, these are usually the ways that I can connect my emotions. So you can do it that way. Or another way, which is more practical, if you're not into music, you can just pay attention to what happens in your body as you do self-monitoring. Most frequently, you pay attention to your shoulders, chest, and your abdomen. And then note the specific sensations. People will sometimes feel pressure, squeezing, or something, or changes in the way they breathe, or they will feel something in their stomach, like pulling, pressure. Write these down, and then when you review your logs, try to see if there are any connections between specific sensations or specific body parts and specific thoughts. That will help you make the link. Then you can find, one of the commonly used labels like happiness, sadness, anxiety, anger, whatever, or you can simply come up with a name for yourself. My clients very frequently invent their own emotions based on these connections that they make, because the only thing that's important is that you and your therapist understand what you're talking about and that it's useful for you. How you're going to call it, that's really not as relevant. Thank you. You're welcome. I started pulling my hair after more than 30 years since I was an adolescent. Is there a scientific reason behind this, or just due to likely increased anxiety? Well, I'm not sure what you mean if there's a scientific reason behind it, but there are a lot of studies that deal with how we form habits and how we forget things and whether or not we ever really forget things. And these behavioral patterns that we have and that have served a purpose for a while can sometimes reemerge if they can reemerge if you have the same need or the same issue and haven't developed more useful or healthier coping patterns. So if your anxiety is spiking now and you didn't develop a coping mechanism which is more effective or a way to process your anxiety which is healthier, then you're very likely to fall back on whatever it is that once helped you. There's a kind of economy to our psyche that we like to recycle things and then use them in different contexts for different purposes. So the same goes for this. You can never use it again, but then if you didn't develop a better way to deal with the issue, it will come back again. It's similar to what I said about the urge arising in certain situations as an indication of a need. So that might be the reason. If you're experiencing more anxiety now, then make sure to deal with the anxiety. Is this recorded? I joined later. Yes, it is, and you will receive a link. I've read that mania is linked to anxiety, but 18 years into, oh, you mean trichotillomania. I don't necessarily feel anxious when I pull. I usually feel perfectly all right with my pulling. In your experience, do you find that people who feel this way still tend to benefit from treating their pulling with these techniques? Yes, I mean, habit reversal is about reversing habits, as the name says. So whatever the underlying cause is, you can reverse a habit by doing this. However, I would like to point out that the fact that you don't feel anxious while you pull is because pulling works. Pulling helps you self-soothe, so you're actually self-soothing. Therefore, you probably wouldn't feel as anxious. And also, the question is how well can you recognize your emotions, and how do you typically recognize anxiety? So what I would suggest for you is if your pulling is focused, then when you feel the urge coming on, focus really intently on your body and listen to what it's saying. So that will help you differentiate what the emotional response is behind it. I was going to say something else. Oh yes, in acceptance and commitment therapy, there is a concept that we call experiential avoidance. And experiential, this sort of, it's essentially, to borrow a term from psychoanalysis, it's a defense mechanism. When we really don't know how to deal with emotions, when we don't understand them, we can't really stand having them, we will use other types of behavior to avoid having to face the emotions. So sometimes people use pulling as a way to actually disconnect from what they feel. So they kind of channel, let's say if it's anxiety, hypothetically, they will kind of channel this nervous energy through pulling, but not necessarily feel anxiety in all its force. So unfortunately, that might mean that pulling is doing its job for you. Please answer my question, I'll appreciate it. Well, Virginia, if I reach this point, then I likely already answered your question, but because I speak so quickly, I understand if you missed it. What's the second best solution for trichotillomania after CBT? Well, it's a complicated question because you basically have two broad options for it. You have either psychotherapy or pharmacotherapy. So if you don't want to use any form of psychotherapy, then try using NAC. And there are also some antidepressants that show some promise, although they're not as effective as psychotherapy. So you can see with your psychiatrist if he or she would prescribe that. In general, psychotherapy, not just CBT, but any form of psychotherapy that works for pulling is more efficient than medication. This is according to the studies that we have now. And if you combine the two, then even better. Any suggestions to promote hair regrowth from your clients, perhaps special shampoos? So I don't have anything from my clients, but I do have from dermatology in medical school. So there's a drug called minoxidil, which you can get over the counter, I think, which you can use it as a type of spray, and then you can spray it on where you have a bald spot, and that should stimulate hair growth after a while. That was a drug that was initially, if I remember, medical school was a while ago, it was initially developed to be a medication for hypertension, and then they realized that the side effect is hair growth everywhere when you take it as a pill. So they basically rebranded it as a hair growth solution. So that works. So you can try that. There are other, like there are some receptor blockers that will help with hair growth, but the name is not coming to me right now. My apologies. But minoxidil is one thing. There are also vitamin supplements that people use and say that slightly they benefit from that are kind of formulated specifically for good hair and to stimulate hair growth. So you can also try these. Unfortunately, it's difficult to predict when hair will grow again and when it won't. Sometimes I've had clients who were pulling for decades and then their hair grows back, and then some clients who pull for a few years and then their hair doesn't grow back. So to my knowledge, there are no rules. Maybe a dermatologist would be able to give you a better answer to that. Thank you for the webinar. It helped me start my journey and hopefully nip this habit in the bud. Well, good luck, and I hope you do. And I'm really happy that it was useful. Is there a link between pulling, picking, and taking Adderall for ADHD? So I think I already addressed this question in one form or another. I feel like a failure. I'm 28 years old. I pull my hair. I feel lonely because I avoid people in relationships. I haven't figured out what field I want to work in. I feel all this stress is leading me to pull more and more and gets me into a depressive mode. Well, habit reversal training is a good place to start. If you're struggling from depression as well, then it would really be useful if you can address both things at the same time. And if you have to choose, then I would say depression would take precedence over hair pulling, at least in the beginning. So for depression, I guess I would advise you to find a therapist. Literally any therapist should be able to deal with depression. And then you can use Trickstop, for example, for hair pulling, and then you can use your therapy for depression, and therapists can even coordinate. But habit reversal training is simple and it works. So I understand that it's really hard, but you have a good tool here. So make sure to try it at least. Sometimes it feels like I'm doing it unconsciously. I end up realizing that I'm doing it when I already pulled the hair. How to manage these situations. So that would be automatic or mindless or unconscious pulling. So that's one of the main two types of pulling. This kind of pulling, if you're doing habit reversal training, just emphasizes that it's very important to do the awareness training stage much longer. And when you start applying techniques, focus on stimulus control. because stimulus control will reduce the triggers. So even if you're not aware of them, you're likely to pull less. If you can afford it, Habit Aware is a bracelet that might help you there because it vibrates basically every time you move your hand. So you will be more aware of what your hand is doing. And that will help you become aware of the motion and then of the habit as well. I also mentioned in the beginning how to use different bracelets that are not expensive or digital to increase your awareness. That's something to consider as well. An area of my scalp that I used to pull frequently is now isolated patch of gray hair. Is this typical? I wouldn't say that it's typical, but it's also not very uncommon either. When you pull your hair, every time when you pull a hair, you create a very small patch of inflammation around the root of the hair, so in your scalp. When you have chronic inflammation, this can sometimes disturb the pigment synthesis processes in your skin as well as in your hair. So it's the chronic inflammation that kind of damage these cells so they don't produce the pigment as they used to before. This is something that might come back after a while, but I can't really guarantee that because I've seen it go both ways. But it is due to chronic inflammation. Do you know if trick exists in animals as well? Or is this just a human condition? Any research on that? Thanks for these webinars, they're very helpful. There actually is research on that. We wouldn't call it trick in animals, but the study that I read called it excessive self-grooming. So birds exhibit this and some other types of mammals as well. So yes, it exists, although we can't, so even if we observe the same behavior, we can't really know if it does the same thing, if you know what I mean, because humans can use language and then we can explain our experience and connect this. I don't know that we can ask a bird, you know, hey there, raven, feeling anxious today. So it doesn't work the same way. But in terms of the behavior, that some animals groom a little more than they should, yes. But whether it's trichotillomania, we can't really know. Or maybe, you know, veterinarians would know if we can know. But from my perspective as a psychologist, I don't know that we can know. Okay, so there's still 15 questions that I didn't get to, but it's getting kind of late. So I think this is a good place to stop. The user that asked several times that I answered their question, if I didn't answer your question because I don't see anything else from you specifically, you can please email me your question, and on Monday I will be answering it at a certain point. So next month, in December, we will be talking about emotional avoidance. Hope to see you then. You will receive an email telling you when the webinar when it will be scheduled. And if you haven't noticed, you have a discount in the next 7 days if you decide to register for the program for the first time. So make sure you take advantage of it. And I hope to see you in December. Have a nice evening and hope it was useful. Bye.